Hello and welcome to the Evidence-Based Compliance and Assurance webinar series co-hosted by the Environmental Protection Agency and EPIC at Johns Hopkins University. This webinar series helps program administrators understand how collaborations with academics can identify effective and measurable approaches to compliance. Each webinar is either an academic presenter or a team of academic and program staff collaborators. 40 to 45 minutes are allocated to the presenter, and then we leave around 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. However, please feel free to enter questions during the whole presentation, and we will pass them on to the speaker. Our next webinar will be on November 12th at noon Eastern daytime. And it will be Judith van Erp from Utrecht University. Today, we are delighted to present Esther Versluis from Maastricht University, and she's going to be talking to us about what U.S. environmental regulators can learn from successes and failures of European regulators. So without further ado, please take it away, Esther, and I'm going to stop you.
Okay, well, I'm really sorry for the inconvenience. I hope we settled it now, so let's give it a try and we'll see whether it works. So first of all, many thanks for joining us today, and obviously many thanks for the Johns Hopkins University to invite me for this nice event. As you can see, sitting at home here, unfortunately we are experiencing increasing COVID numbers again here in Europe. So I hope you are still all okay on the other side of the Atlantic. Okay, maybe just a short indication of where I am actually. I'm here located in a very beautiful city of Maastricht, one of the oldest cities in the Netherlands. We actually have a competition going with Nijmegen, which is a bit further on which city actually is the eldest. But we also have the youngest university of the Netherlands, and we're located very closely to the border of Belgium and Germany. So that's why we also have so many international students. We actually have more German students than we have Dutch students. But obviously, I'm not going to talk about Maastricht or Maastricht University today. I'm going to talk about what US regulators can potentially learn from successes and failures of European regulators. Well, I'm going to disappoint you now a little bit already, because I don't know to what extent I will really be able to explicitly address lessons learned. I think you all are in a much better position to identify and notice what lessons might actually be worthwhile. I will really just today outline a little bit more insight and in-depth information about the European Union, and particularly about compliance with environmental policy within the European Union. So this is also what my own research is very much focused on, really focused on the compliance with EU legislation. And how do we really make sure that 27 different member states of the European Union actually comply with this legislation? And I realize maybe that this angle is a bit of an outsider perspective compared to the topics that have been discussed before in this webinar series, but I hope that it will be able to provide some added value, if only to realizing that the problems that you might actually experience with compliance in the US context are by no means exceptional, and that problems are encountered across the globe. So, what are the difficulties in the EU when it comes to ensuring compliance? Well, here's maybe just a very brief pictures indicating what the complexity is about. The European Union started in the late 1970s with only 6 member states. And these were 6 member states that were very much aligned and very much alike and very much had similar administrative cultures, administrative structures, similar ways of thinking. Whereas if we look at the current situation, we are witnessing a European Union of 27 member states after the United Kingdom leaving us. And as you can imagine, and this cartoon indicating who drinks what type of coffee already illustrates that it has become much more difficult to actually ensure proper handling of legislation in the European Union. Surprisingly, maybe to you, it is not so much the finding an agreement on reaching decisions that is actually causing difficulties. The European Union relatively easily manages to make decisions. And why is this the case? This is the case because actually most of the legislation is made based on consensus. We do have a voting system where the different countries actually vote on different legislative proposals, but this voting is in practice hardly ever used. It's really a system based on consensus. I will say a few more things about that in a moment. What is problematic and what is the difficulty of ensuring compliance in the EU is that these are 27 countries with very, very different legal cultures. In some countries, for example, the northern member states, you really see that rules are there to be followed. In the Scandinavian countries, if you have a red light for traffic, you stop no matter what. Whereas in the southern member states of the European Union, rules are much more seen as some form of guidance that you could live up to, but maybe also not, depending a little bit on the situation. So are there any lessons that we can learn for you guys based in the United States from the successes and failures of compliance with EU legislation? Well, in order to delve into that, I think it would be good to say a few words on how EU environmental policy is actually made. Because this is not an easy endeavor. I actually, at my university, I work at the Bachelor European Studies, and there we have 3 years of showing our students how the European Union really works in practice. So I do not have the intention to explain that entirely to you now. But what is essential is to realize that how EU policy is made very much differs per sector. In some cases, we have strong responsibilities for the European Union, and there's really a shared responsibility between the EU and the member states. Whereas in other cases, it's really hardly any involvement of the EU. Maybe some of the two extremes. Environmental policy really is on the one end of the spectrum with an enormous amount of responsibilities at the European level, whereas health policy, for example, is still a topic that is very much nationally regulated within the EU. And that also explains why we currently are in the midst of a bit of a crisis in which the EU is actually hardly able to regulate this COVID-19 crisis. But as I said, in the environmental sector, it's really the EU in the driving seat. So that also indicates that, or leads to the situation that about 90% of all national environmental policy in all the different member states really comes from the EU. So how does that work? Very briefly, as is indicated by this picture, it's the European Commission, and the Commission is supposed to be an independent body that proposes the legislation. So it drafts the legislation also in cooperation with expert groups. And then it's up to the Council of Ministers that is composed of all the governments of the 27 member states. So we have a Council for Environmental Policy where all the national environmental ministers are located. And we have a European Parliament that is directly elected by the European citizens. And these then jointly need to decide on EU legislation. As I mentioned before, the making of European legislation is not so much the problem. You really see that this system in which many different actors are actually involved in the making of this legislation, combined with the system being very much focused on consensus, leads to a situation in which politics does come into play, but not so much. It's really the technical administrators that are in the driving seat in the European Union, particularly when it comes to environmental policy. What does this lead to? This leads to a situation in which legislation is made in Brussels. We very much equate the European Union with Brussels because that's the capital of the EU. And this leads to a bit of a blaming game that is also relevant to take into consideration when we in a moment start talking about compliance and enforcement. Because environmental policy is made based on consensus, this means that some countries sometimes win some and sometimes you lose some in this game of making legislation. And this also implies that member states are very quick in scapegoatscaping, and blaming Brussels for making them, the member states, do things that they did not want. And you very strongly see this in the field of environmental policy as well, where you see that Brussels has strong aims to really beef up its environmental awareness, and then we see member states that then start to blame Brussels. So particularly in those countries where we see right-wing politicians taking the lead more and more, you see this blaming taking place. You very much witness that these countries say, yeah, well, we don't want this environmental policy, but it's Brussels making us do it. What implications does that have for how EU policy is made, for who is actually responsible for enforcement? Well, this is also a complicated situation in the EU. On the one hand, it's Brussels that makes the policy, but it's the member states who are fully 100% responsible for its implementation. So in principle, this is a very strict division of tasks. The EU, Brussels makes the policy, the member states implement it. But the European Commission is assigned what we called this task of being the guardian of the treaties. And it has this role that is very nicely, not extremely explicitly described in the legal treaties, of overseeing member state compliance. Well, what in the long run can the Commission then do? It can, together with the European Court of Justice, take member states to the court and fine them actually for situations of non-compliance. We also have a European Environment Agency. But it is, I would say, it does not really resemble what you have with the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. This European Environment Agency is really a paper tiger. It has no regulatory power, and it should really be considered as an information agency, in the sense that what it does is collect information from all the 27 different member states and report about that. It does not have its own inspectors. It does not have the power to impose sanctions. So enforcement is really done by the local authorities in all these 27 member states. And only the Commission and the European Court of Justice can impose sanctions in the end. I will come back to that in a moment, what implications this actually have. So when we look at the situation in the EU, and here we have the numbers for last year, for 2019, these are the numbers of infringements per member states in 2019 in the environmental sector alone. So we had 237 infringements in all these various member states. And you can see in this graph, we have several environmental laggards, if you will, and the numbers for this year are not actually surprising. We see the same countries scoring very low or very high, if you will, on the number of infringements time and again. So countries such as Spain and Greece that score relatively high here, we see that year after year. And we also see year after year that some of these smaller Eastern European countries, they only have a few cases per year, and they score really well when it comes to infringements. There's something to be said about these numbers and what these numbers do and do not really tell us. First of all, this might lead to the impression that some countries are always performing very well and other countries are not so much performing well. However, there are two major problems with these type of insights. The first problem is that these numbers only say something about the legal stage of what we call transposition. European environmental policy is mostly making use of this legal instrument that we call directives. And these directives are not directly applicable in the member states, but they first need to be transposed into national legislation. Well, why do some of these Eastern European countries always score extremely well when it comes to implementing and thus do not have many infringements in the field of environmental policy? This is simply the case because these countries did not have a long national history of having environmental policy. So what they do is they take the literal words of the European legislation and directly, literally transpose them into national legislation. This is a relatively easy task, and there's not a lot of overlap or contrast with previous existing legislation. Whereas in some other countries that are normally considered to be strong when it comes to environmental awareness, such as Germany or some of the Scandinavian countries, their infringement cases are caused by different reasons. For them, it is much more the difficulty of trying to fit in the new European legislation in the existing body of environmental legislation that they already have in place. The second major problem with these infringement data is that they do not tell us very much about the state of affairs when it comes to non-compliance in the environmental field as such. When you look at the overall infringement numbers in the EU, so if you compare these numbers on environmental legislation to other sectors, you will see, well, in the long history of European legislation, environment is always in the top three, most often actually the number one when it comes to the number of infringements. And some scholars, it led them to the conclusion that implementation and enforcement is worst in the field of environmental policy. We cannot conclude this, however. Why can we not conclude this? Because the European Commission really has a strong information deficit. The European Commission is a relatively small body, and it does not have a lot of people working on and being responsible for environmental policy. So this handful of people will not be able to know the ins and outs of compliance with environmental policy in all the 27 different member states. So how do they come to these relatively high numbers of infringements? It's a very simple explanation. Because in the environmental sector, we have quite a few relatively active NGOs. And these NGOs actually point the Commission to infringements. They launch complaints. There's a complaint procedure on the website of the European Commission, and once a complaint is launched, the Commission is obliged to actually start an infringement procedure. So that's the core reason why we see so many infringements in the environmental sector, because there are so many active NGOs in this field. So what is most problematic about EU compliance? Well, first of all, it's not so much this legal transposition. I already gave the example of literal transposition that quite a few member states actually make use of. And also there is definitely a problem with transposition, but this is always, it's simply a matter of time. In the long run, in the end, all member states do transpose environmental legislation into their national legislation. The real problems really arise in the stage of what we call practical implementation, right? Making sure that companies really start complying with the legislation and that it's really being enforced by environmental inspectors. This is the real problem in the European Union. Also because there are quite a few countries that use this tool of literal transposition. And European directives, per definition, are formulated relatively broadly and vaguely in order to ensure that all these 27 member states can actually reach consensus. And the idea of using directives that first need to be transposed into national legislation is actually that you can adjust it to your national situation. But so many countries not doing this, but literally transposing the text into national legislation, leads to national environmental legislation that is extremely vague and difficult to really put into practice. So a lot of the countries in the EU are what we call worlds of dead letters, where there's a lot of European legislation on paper, but in practice, in reality, not that much is happening. I refer here to an article that I published quite a while ago that was based on my own doctoral dissertation, where I analyzed EU and chemical policy. And this article is very explicitly about one EU directive, the Safety Data Sheets Directive. You might be familiar, you might have something like safety data sheets yourself, indicating also the environmental impact. research where I compared 4 member states in what they really do with this legislation in practice is really the situation of even rules, uneven practices. So all 4 countries that I analyzed, they perfectly transposed the legislation and they all did it in relatively the same manner. But when it came to the actual practical implementation, I realized that in 3 of the 4 member states, this legislation was really not enforced at all. It was really just only paper trail and nothing really changed in practice. Well, why was this the case? I will not go in depth. If you're interested in this, by all means, do read the article. But why was this the case? Mostly because all the inspectors that I actually interviewed indicated a lack of perceived salience of the topic. They stated, well, there's so much legislation that we need to enforce, and this topic really just not have our priority. So it really became a law on paper only. Well, what does the European Commission try to do about this? As I said before, right, it's a relatively small organization. It does not have eyes and ears in the member states. It does not have its own inspectors. So it's really dependent on these 27 member states to actually do what they are being asked to do. So this is really what is most problematic for the European Commission. There's really what we call this information deficit. Well, the situation I sketched before with the European Environmental Agency, it does not really help the European Commission. This agency does not really have any powers. Well, why is this the case? Well, this agency was set up in the 1990s, and back then the decision on whether or not to have an environmental agency was based on unanimity voting. So one country could already block the agency for being set up. And back then, the environmental laggards, the member states, particularly in the south of Europe, they all blocked a more powerful agency, because the original plans and ideas for this agency was to have an agency with its own inspectors and sanctioning tools. But this was vetoed by the southern European member states. So what does the Commission try to do? For this, I very briefly bring you to some of the theories that we use in our research. And these are, I refer here to 3 international relations theories. And these are 3 theories that are being used to understand, basically the core question of these theories is, why do countries comply with international legislation? Why do they do that? Why do they transfer power and competences and in the end comply or not comply? And very briefly, the rationalist approach argues that non-compliance simply takes place because member states have conducted their own strategic, rational cost-benefit analysis. And non-compliance takes place if the costs of compliance simply outweigh its benefits. So if this is the case, the strategy for the European Commission to act upon this should really be playing a policeman and ensuring that you monitor what the countries are doing and that you sanction in the case you witness infringements. A competing management approach argues, well, no, this is too far-fetched. The idea of the management approach is that in principle, countries do intend to live up to the rules. And the core reason why there actually is non-compliance is because countries either lack the resources or the expertise for doing so, or they didn't understand the rules. So if this is your take on non-compliance, the Commission should much more act, not so much as a policeman, that will only be counterproductive, but should act more as a facilitator and provide guidelines and training or organize inspections. Lastly, the constructivist approach argues that non-compliance mostly takes place if there is a situation in which the member states have not really internalized the rules as appropriate behavior. So the argument here is that compliance will mostly take place if those countries that need to ensure compliance actually are socialized into the rules being adopted being also the appropriate behavior. So if this is the case, the Commission should much more act as a teacher of norms and should engage in best practice sharing or civil society engagement.
Hi, Esther. We have a question from Bo Ferraro. It's an understanding question. Does the European Union Commission have the authority to address cross-boundary pollution among its members?
Yes, it does. Yeah. So, and that is exactly why you see that there is so much competences in the field of environmental policy at the level of the European Commission, because it is indeed such an international topic. You need the Commission as what we call an independent arbitrator to also settle conflicts between member states. Does that answer the question? Are there any other questions that I could respond to while I'm at it?
Not at this time. I'll let you know
great.
if more questions come in.
Sure, thanks. So when you look at what the European Commission really does in light of these different compliance theories, the interesting situation is that for an international organization, if you compare it to other international organizations, the European Union actually really has quite far-reaching powers and competences, right? It can sanction, whereas there are not that many other international organizations that can. But what you see happening in practice is that it does not use this power that often. And this is really tied in with this information deficit, with the Commission not really knowing what is really happening in all these 27 different member states. So what you see is that the Commission much more tries to act as a facilitator or as a teacher of norms, trying to explain to the member states what the rules really are, trying to help them with providing guidelines, trying to organize instances of sharing of best practices. So this is really what the Commission is being focused on. How does that really do this? Interestingly, what we see happening the last couple of years is that the Commission is realizing very much that it's a bit in a split, right? On the one hand, it's Brussels making the legislation, but then they hardly have any right or any say in what's then really happening in the compliance stage. So what you see is that the Commission tries to very incrementally ensure that more of these enforcement powers actually come to the European Union. Well, how does it do that? It does so via an increasing number of European agencies and European networks. So how this works is that particularly in policy sectors where you see that member states are willing to cooperate more and are willing to share implementation and enforcement strategies and styles, you see that there's a huge reluctance at the level of national politics. The European Union is not popular at the moment, so it's extremely difficult for politicians to argue in the national media that more power has been transferred to Brussels. Brussels really has a very negative connotation with being this huge bureaucratic organization that eats away all our national money. So it's not a popular decision to transfer more competences to Brussels. So what did they strategically do? They have created these networks of agencies and networks that are not located in Brussels, but are located in all different capitals and regions of the European Union. The European Environment Agency, for example, is located in Denmark, in Copenhagen. So it's very much a strategic tool to have more control over what the member states are doing when it comes to implementing European legislation. And we most often actually see this happening in fields where we recently had a crisis. So immediately after the financial crisis, at first there was no competences at all at the European level in the field of the financial sector. But after the financial crisis, we immediately see the setting up of 3 very powerful and very strong financial agencies. The same, everybody is predicting, will now happen with health policy. As I said before, health policy is still a national competence in the European Union. But everybody in the European Union now realizes that it leads to huge difficulties because the European Union is really incapable of handling the COVID crisis. So the prediction is that also in the field of health, we in the next couple of years will see a transfer of powers to the European Union. This did not yet happen in the environmental sector. First of all, because some of the stronger member states in the European Union are also perceived to be environmental laggards. So they really push back any attempt of transferring more competencies and power in this particular field. So there is an EU agency, but it's a very weak one. It does not, as I said, really have these competences. There is a network, Impel, it's basically the implementation of European legislation network. And this is a very strong, soft tool, if I may call it like that. It does not have any official competences, but it really very strongly influences how different member states really implement European environmental policy. How does it work? First of all, it works very much via this indication of the importance of interdependence. And I have here a quote from one of my interviewees. It's not in the environmental sector, but in the sector of product safety. But it's extremely applicable to environmental policy as well. So this person said, well, product safety, it's a topic of which you cannot think in national terms only. I spoke to a business operator that said, so my product is not admitted to the end report. I will take it to Hamburg and import it to Europe from there. Then I answered, I will inform my colleagues from Hamburg that this product is coming to them. My conversation partner didn't quite like that. This shows that it doesn't work to think nationally. We're in an international European market, so we have to cooperate. Otherwise, products will enter our market after we have just sent them back because they're unsafe. This is exactly the situation that also applies to the environmental sector. So what you see is that at a political level, there is huge unwillingness to really cooperate. But at the level of the inspectors, the administrators, you see strong willingness because they are so much aware of the importance of interdependence. If inspectors, environmental inspectors in Belgium are not ensuring to enforce European legislation at all, it directly impacts on the situation here in the Netherlands. So that's why you see strong cooperation in this Impel network. Does not have any power, does not have any competences, but has huge impact on the level of what the constructivists would call socialization, ensuring that those participating in these networks start sharing their problems and start thinking alike. Almost there. Only 2 more slides. The second issue that our research into these agencies and networks very much showed us is that the European Union not so much being able to rely on sanctions because of this lack of information, as I mentioned before. One other thing that really works and that really helps in trying to stimulate compliance in the member states is somehow creating mutual trust. And also here I have a quote to briefly outline what I mean with this issue. Again, this is in the field of product safety, but applies also just as much to the environmental sector. So here it's stated, whenever these things take place in Brussels, it's too stiff, it's too strict, too formal, too commission-centered. And whenever ProSafe meetings take place, because it's in different locations, everything changes. We had a commission representative in one of our project meetings, and the meeting was on the same level of great cooperation because it was not in Brussels. It was in Warsaw, and everybody felt very safe. So here the argument is, and I interviewed quite a few inspectors in many different member states. And the thing that comes back time and again is that they argue that if you want to stimulate international cooperation between all these different member states, that all have to comply with the same legislation, but that are confronted with so many different cultures, compliance cultures, the only thing that really helps is for us to connect and talk to each other. And the best way in which we can actually do this is not in formal meetings in Brussels, because then if the meeting takes place in Brussels and there is a Commission representative chairing the meeting, nobody will openly share what their problems really are, because they're all afraid that the Commission might use this information to start an infringement procedure. So the only really sharing of information, sharing of problems, and thus sharing of potential solutions to solve the problems and thus to stimulate compliance taking place, it only takes place in informal meetings outside of the scope of Brussels. So when asked, I interviewed as I said, in quite a few member states and also in quite a few of these European networks and agencies, not only in the environmental sector, but also in other policy sectors. And this is really the returning observation, that if you really want to stimulate compliance with European legislation, you need this common sense of awareness of this being the type of legislation that we need to implement and enforce. And this will only happen in such an atmosphere of mutual trust and a high amount of interdependence. So in sum, what we actually see happening within the European Union, and this is a trend that we witness over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, it is that there is much less focus on sanctioning. Also, the European Commission, well, I showed the numbers before, right, of these infringement cases, and it might seem quite a lot, but these are really only cases about legal transposition, and in the end, these cases all make it to the end. But the most problems really lie in the stage after that, the stage of really ensuring that the legislation is put into practice at the street level. And there we see that the EU is not using sanctions whatsoever, partly because it is incapable of doing so, because it simply does not have that information. It really has an information deficit about what is happening in all these different member states. And that's why we in the EU see much more focus on softer tools that really aim to stimulate mutual learning and information sharing. That was it, what I wanted to share with you. I'm really curious to what extent this resonates in the US context. I can very well imagine that things might be relatively similar, even though it being a federal state, you obviously also have the different states that have their own different cultures in complying with federal environmental legislation. So I'm very curious to see how and to what extent this somehow is also visible, this turn to more softer tools in the US context. Many thanks.
So Esther, I'm guessing that people will start asking questions, but I have a few to get us started while other people start typing theirs in. So one of my questions is based on something you noted earlier in the presentation about the reliance on NGOs. So does the European Commission do anything to encourage NGO monitoring? And is the Commission taking an active role in directing NGO effort, or is the Commission mostly just accepting whatever the NGOs offer?
Both. Obviously, the Commission is actually obliged to take on board whatever NGOs feed in, particularly when they use the official complaint procedure. But what we also see within the EU, there's other colleagues who actually analyze the role of lobbying in the European Union. They very much demonstrate that there is, and it might definitely not be different in the United States, I presume, that there is really a strong focus on industry lobbying. And the Commission is very much aware of that, and that's why they actually have a system in place that they also financially support more societal NGOs, so consumer organizations, but also environmental organizations. So there's not only active support in the sense that they try to make sure that they talk to an equal number of representatives of different part of the different sectors, so to say, but they also actually financially support NGOs that need it.
Thanks for that. So we have another question from Paul Ferraro. Do European national environmental agents have their own professional association that is outside of the European Union Commission, where they meet, discuss, and share information?
No, not really. And the question is about whether these different national organizations come together without the European Commission being there, right? Do I understand it correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's not so much the case.
Interpretation.
Yeah. No, that's not so much the case.
Okay, so we have. Sorry, go ahead. Okay, we have another question from Leah Johannes, who says, great presentation, very interesting. In EU policymaking, once a directive is promulgated, does it apply across the 27 member states right away, or is there a lag until member states transpose? There are going to be a couple of questions, and you can choose which to answer. Do directives or national level laws take precedence? And is there a certain level of stringency that national laws must attain? And is there an incentive to develop directives that are or seem very stringent because the Commission is accounting for the likelihood that some member states will implement than other states?
Sorry, the last question I didn't get so much because the connection was a bit bad, but I got some of the earlier questions really about directives. So there's two core legal instruments being used in the EU. On the one hand, it's regulations, and the regulations are directly applicable, and they overrule national law immediately from the moment they enter into force. For directives, they do not immediately apply in the different member states because there's this transition into national law that is required. And there is a deadline, there is a transposition deadline by which member states are obliged to have national legislation in place. But member states rarely get these deadlines. There's always a very strong delay. And the core reason for using directives is that it is easier to adopt them because member states still have some leeway in how they actually transpose it into national legislation. And particularly in the environmental sector, they use something what we call minimum directives. And this is asked for by the environmental or the real environmental leaders, because they often already have much higher legislation in place compared to what the European Commission is proposing. So having a minimum directive allows them to keep their higher national standards. I missed some of the other questions. I'm sorry. Do let me know if I missed out on anything.
That's okay. It sounded like you answered. So the last part of the question was just, is there an incentive to develop directives that seem more stringent because the Commission thinks that member states will enforce them less than other states? And it sounds like you're saying it's almost the opposite, that they want to establish like a baseline that's actually less stringent.
Yeah, and that's required because the differences between the 27 member states when it comes to the level of their environmental policy, they're extreme, they're huge. I mean, some of the Eastern European member states that joined the EU hardly had any environmental legislation, and trying to make sure that there's then a common level playing field with countries like Denmark that had really high standards, that's almost impossible. So they try to find a middle ground, but then allow the leaders to go beyond what is actually agreed.
So I have another question that I wanted to ask. It's kind of a reflection on some of your description relative to my perception of the US. So it seems like the European Commission is forced to rely on voluntary approaches to member state compliance. And even when regulators in the US have coercive tools, it seems that they would often prefer to use voluntary approaches if possible. So I'm wondering if there are quantitative evaluations of the Commission's voluntary approaches, and if so, if you've noticed any patterns in where they've been particularly effective.
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's impossible to answer, because what we see happening is that some of these informal approaches actually take place behind closed doors. So we have something that is called the EU pilot. It's a stupid name. It was set up as a pilot project and it's still called EU pilot. And basically what it does is it's an informal consultation stage where the Commission talks to civil servants in member states about their implementation problems and tries to help them to solve these problems before actually making it to the official infringement stage. But there is no insight into what happens in this pilot project. The Commission does provide us with some numbers on cases opened, but it does not tell us anything. I once had a very good master student that I really pushed on this case and asked him to do interviews, but also member state officials are very secretive about this. Core reason being that only, and it links back to what I mentioned before with the informality, right? Only in this informal setting, officials are comfortable in really opening up and talking about the problems that they experience. So there's, to my frustration, there's no quantitative data available on that.
So I'm realizing now that Paul Ferraro asked basically the same question as me about empirical evidence about the software tools actually working. Paul, I'm not seeing additional questions right now. Are you seeing anything else?
No, I'm not seeing any more new questions at this moment.
Okay. Looks like there's another one here. Okay, so I have an anonymous question here from, it says, do the EU countries compete with each other to attract business and industry? And if so, what are the implications for the ability of the countries to then properly regulate these industries that they attracted?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In my PhD dissertation, where I looked into chemical legislation, I looked into one of the core EU chemical policies that is about preventing major accidents in companies that house a lot of dangerous substances. And there and this is legislation that really only applies to the major multinationals, the big installations that really contain and house a lot of dangerous chemicals. And for this, I really interviewed a lot of these multinational companies. And this was actually a question that I also asked them, to what extent the knowledge that these companies have about enforcement cultures in different countries, to what extent this really influenced their their decision of where to locate. And basically there the outcome of this, of course, is not representative. I interviewed I think about 15 of these multinationals. But all of them were very much on the same page in saying, well, no, not really, because even though there are differences, in the end, it's all the same legislation that needs to be complied with. And particularly these multinationals indicated, well, maybe it's much more important for us that we have a solid reputation rather than being in a country that actually does not enforce the rules very strong. So we would like to really make sure that we do not have any accidents. So we actually saw these multinational companies really pushing for more European legislation because they wanted the smaller laggards to actually be on board. So I've not witnessed this in my research, but yeah, it's only a tiny part of what I was seeing, and it could be different in other sectors.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, let's give it a couple of minutes and see if the audience. Okay, so it seems that there are no further questions, Esther. Thank you for a great presentation. This was very interesting and informative. I think most of us didn't know a lot about environmental regulation in the European Union. So thanks for a wonderful presentation. And I'm gonna close out the presentation unless either Paul or Ben have something more to say.
No, just to reiterate the thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I really enjoyed this.